Jamie Coreth, welcome to the Undraped Artist Podcast.
Later.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So, first of all, I'm sorry I missed you at the Porch Society of America conference. I heard you were supposed to come, and then something big kind of happened in your life, or maybe you
Yeah,
just had a really lousy excuse. But I heard a rumor that something kind of big happened in your life.
absolutely. No, I became a dad.
Yeah,
Um, it's been an unmitigated joy. I've loved every second of it. Casper is a really cool little addition.
that's
And
amazing.
we're going through all the kind of like normal things with having a small baby, but kind of enjoying it much more than I thought I would.
Really? You weren't
Yeah.
sure? You weren't sure going in? I
Well, I
guess
knew
none
it
of us
kept
really
comes with
are.
a lot of change, but it's been great. I've sort of weirdly enjoyed the late nights and the it's just the time spent with a completely new person. Um, yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wild. My kids are 20. I have a 20-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old right now. So it's been a while since I went through what you're going through, but man, it seems
Mm.
like it was just yesterday. It's a crazy time, an exciting time. I remember just being scared I was going to kill them somehow, like not feed them
Yeah,
up properly or I'm just,
yeah, exactly.
that's what I remember feeling like from day to day.
I mean, right now it feels kind of like I've got a pet rather than a
Yeah.
companion person. It's kind of
It's
got
like
to
a
keep them
turtle.
going.
They don't really
Yeah,
do much, don't really
yeah,
think much. At least you don't think they think.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And he's now starting to sort of track my movements and smile at me, so he does now know I'm in the room.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Do you know
it's
what's
all
crazy? I don't know if you're aware of this, but what amazed me is that there was this new thing going on when my kids were little. I can't remember what it's called. It was a video that someone had produced. Signing time. Signing time. They might still have it. But we just throw this video on the TV from the time they were 3 months or something old and on. And by the time
okay.
they were 6 months old, they could communicate with us through sign language.
Really?
Yeah, dude. And my kids
Uh,
aren't there's normal kids. I mean, this is normal.
Yeah.
Like, and I mean, I think they're exceptional,
So
but
I'm
you know
I'm
what I
really
mean.
curious about the sign language thing.
Yeah,
It sounds amazing.
it's a crazy,
Of
but we
course I did
we
it.
had to learn it a little bit too, but it's weird to see these little kids with these tiny little chubby hands and they're just barely getting muscle control at all, and yet they're like, more food, and just saying, and they even learned sorry at a pretty before they could speak, which is a pretty insane concept if you think about it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the reason I
And that's
bring
got to
that
be
up
good
is
for the
because
brain development, surely.
I know the reason I bring that up is because I made that joke that they're just kind of like a turtle right now. But in
Yeah,
reality, man, it's crazy. There's probably a lot more going on in there than you can
yeah,
imagine. You know,
yeah.
it's
Well, I have a dog called Turtle, and so maybe I'll play the same sign video for him and see which between him and Casper can work it out
Did you
faster
say a
more.
dog?
Yeah, yeah. I have a dog called
Yeah,
Turtle.
the problem is dogs don't have pretty very good hands, but you could try it.
Yeah, that's true. It's he's limited.
It's a
Uh,
little limited. That's hilarious. But anyway, congrats. You're gonna love being a dad.
very much.
It's definitely a great thing. All right, so tell me a little bit about you and about your past. How did you end up becoming an artist?
Well, the path to becoming an artist, in a sense, started quite young. Although I hadn't really sort of consciously decided to be a painter until much, much more recently. My dad is a sculptor, so to a certain extent, I kind of grew up with it. At least my earliest memories are kind of spent in his studio, uh, helping out with some of the kind of larger scale projects he would work on. So everything from sort of tabletop sculptures of animals through to there's a life-size elephant that he built once.
No
And
way.
the big ones, it required some assistance. So me and my siblings would be there kind of mixing his plaster and passing him. I mean, the elephant was made by welding big steel girders together and then padding it out with big polystyrene blocks on the inside to get the kind of bulk mass shape of the elephant. Then chicken wire, and then plaster dipped with linen, and the linen was kind of put onto the outside of the
Wait,
elephant,
so it
and
was
then
like a giant paper
scratched.
mache thing, kind of?
Basically, yeah, and
So it wasn't
it worked
bronzed.
very well. It was. So they once that was made, the plaster version, the foundry guys came in and took sort of panel casts of it, and then welded the panels together into a bronze replica.
So why not
Um,
clay?
I think at that scale, and it was 14 feet, it's
Man.
just a lot of play.
Okay.
And I just think it's also outside, difficult to deal with the rain and so on.
Oh.
I think in terms of practicality, plaster when you go that large is easier to work with than clay.
Does he kind of
Uh,
like carve into it and stuff? Is that so? Is it sort of an additive
yeah,
subtractive back and
yeah.
forth?
Okay, so well, that's quite a sort of standalone piece, but on the whole, plaster does seem to be quite good for exactly as you say, splattering it on, building up a kind of good amount of body, and then carving back into it.
Hmm.
Uh, Certainly, those plaster sculptures he's made have had a different aesthetic to the clay ones,
Right. Right.
which are much more like a kind of upscaled version of the small plasticine models.
Right.
You sort of see his thumbprint in it, and sort of there's just a kind of energy to it, which is a bit different. Um, but yeah, anyway, so my childhood was, really kind of framed by his approach to his art, and I also think I wouldn't necessarily have thought of art as being a possible profession without that. I don't think a lot of people it sort of occurs to them as an option in life. And so, certainly having dad as a professional sculptor was something that did mean something to me as an option. And so I definitely had it in my head that being an artist could be something that I could pursue. Um,
Hmm.
and it was a little bit fractured in some ways, kind of growing through the school system. For sure, drawing and painting was the thing I enjoyed the most. No doubt about it, and that was the thing I really prided myself on. But I, like a lot of people who go through the ateliers, found myself like kind of butting up against the approach to teaching art at school. For sure, there were a couple of teachers who really helped me out. Um, but then again, when it came to sort of A level and GCSE levels, um, I I wanted to pursue drawing at a higher level, and I just found myself unable to work out how to better my approach to drawing. So I felt a little bit on my own, and a lot of well, basically all of my school artwork was unsurprisingly animals. I'd go home and I'd hear about the trip Dad just done to some part of the world where he'd come back and done an exhibition on some species or another, and I and I then would take some of that energy back with me to school and would make some artworks about tigers or polar bears or something.
Hmm.
Um, so to be perfectly honest, when I got to the end of school, I did consider studying fine art as a degree, but I was really disillusioned by it, and to be honest, it really didn't interest me at all. So
Wait,
one of my
what do you mean by
teachers,
disillusioned by it?
well, I had a really sort of strong interest in drawing and painting, but I found that there didn't feel like there was any kind of structure for teaching it. In a way that you had since discovered in Florence. Um, so I think I felt very frustrated. I
So did you discover that because you
possibly,
took a few classes, or you just observed from outside the university?
sorry, discover the Florence School.
No, 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 no. The university didn't really have a good teaching, or a good format for
Yeah,
teaching.
yeah, I read into some of the sort of fine art schools at some universities that interested me, and I had this kind of sense, which it may not have been true, that I would I would effectively be exploring a kind of an approach to art that wasn't very aligned to the kind of practical method that I've been sort of observing with my dad.
Hmm.
Um, and someone had suggested, on the basis of my studies, my A levels, archaeology and anthropology as being potentially quite a good degree for me. So that's what I applied to do. And I absolutely loved it. I thought it was the most fascinating degree. Um, Firstly, it was very open-ended in its framing. So anthropology, study of humans, I mean, literally anything that we do, you can find an anthropological sort of take on it. So, my interests were really oriented towards Paleolithic cave art, so the really ancient origins of painting, and also wildlife conservation, which has been a sort of part of my family in one way or another. And so my dissertation was focused on sort of sacred taboos in Madagascar as related to wildlife conservation. And then the other part of my degree was really focused on Southern African archaeology and San rock art, um,
Hmm.
the Paleolithic cave art in Europe. Um, and it really, really caught me. Like I really got the bug for it. And I wanted to, after I got my degree, at the very least, pursue a master's, probably in South Africa, where I'd been a few times to help the Rock Art Research Institute trace some Bushman rock art throughout Southern Africa, the San, which are one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Um, you find their rock painting on virtually every single farmstead. If you ask any farmer, do you have sand painting on your property somewhere? Probably they do. And a lot of it is, deteriorating one way or another. And so there's been a big push to record as much as possible of what's there. It really interested me, and I was keen to raise some funding to do that. Um, I had heard of the schools in Florence at that
Okay,
point.
before we go on,
Yeah,
you're being too modest because I think I read that you got these degrees from Oxford.
yeah, yeah. From
Jeez,
a keyboard.
dude, that's incredible. That's
Um,
incredible. So yeah,
well,
so
thanks.
these aren't shabby degrees. I mean, this isn't just some average school that you went to learn this stuff.
No, I was very lucky to go there, and there aren't many places that teach archaeology and anthropology.
Yeah.
Um, and Oxford is one, and they have they have a kind of relationships, reciprocal relationships with different universities around the world, and so the Wits University in Johannesburg was one of them, and the Rock Art Research Institute there. One of my tutors had done a lot of work in conjunction with Southern African archaeology, so it was kind of through that I was led down there. Plus, it kind of offered me an opportunity to travel to other places as well. Like I was very lucky. I went to northern Kenya and helped out on a project at Lake Turkana, which is an extraordinary location for fossil remains. So the eastern side of the lake, for example, dates to around in various points a few million years back, and basically anything that died next to the lake would have been covered over with volcanic ash from
Hmm.
from sort of eruptions over the years, and it fossilizes. So there's a kind of huge area where you get these fossilized remains.
Of what?
So
Of what kinds of things?
fauna, but like the reason most of the paleontologists, the paleoanthropologists were there was for early hominids, so early humans. So it's known for some of the most significant complete finds of early humans, really anywhere on Earth.
No
It's an
kidding.
extraordinary thing. Yeah, you wander around. The size of it is about the size of Wales. It's vast, but you wander around, and I was expecting to find the odd fossil among rocks, but what you're looking for is fossils among fossils, and so the archaeologists who are there spend a lot of time there, and they work very closely with the local tribes who have a very well educated eye for what to look for and what not to look for.
The
So,
tribes do.
yeah, I
No
mean,
kidding.
yeah, I mean, they spend their entire time among these things, and so, um, some of the local guys will have a kind of, it's almost like a sort of search image. They can spot like a sort of a tooth or a fragmented tooth of a, sort of bovid, from sort of 20 yards away, and it'll be among rocks, and it's extraordinary. And
That
they've
is
also pinned
extraordinary. I don't think I'd ever
location.
recognize a fossil if I saw one. Half the time I go to museums and I'm like, how did you
Yeah,
figure out that was a bone?
yeah, well, exactly. They just look
Yeah.
like stone.
Huh.
It's yeah. There's a My whole degree was just the most exciting time intellectually for me, and I adored it. And so I was very keen to pursue that further. I graduated when I was quite young. My finals exams was when I was 20. A lot of people will take a year out. I don't know if how it is in the US, but a lot of people will take a year out between school and starting university. Um, and so I kind of had in my head that maybe I could do the same after university as I hadn't done that. So I knew of the Charles Cecil School in Florence and signed up to do a summer course um, in July. And in my mind, I thought, well, drawing and painting, that's definitely the thing I've enjoyed most. And for sure, I've always had this like sort of bugbear that I just wanted to, at the very least, sort of make progress from where I was at from school. And I kind of like arrogantly assumed I could go to Florence and like learn the basics and walk away from it after a month and sort of practice on
A
and kind of
month?
get everything I needed from it.
Yeah.
And then I started and realized just like what a kind of incredibly naive thought that was. I was paired with someone called Hugo Salishin, who was teaching the course, and we were drawing and doing a charcoal drawing of a portrait model. So he had his drawing on one side of the model, I had my drawing on the other side. Charles Cecil teaches a kind of sight-size method of drawing. I remember watching him work, and he was just so deft in the marks that he made, and the lightness, the sensibility in the drawing, it all came together um, with an ease that it just made me realize, there's no way I can teach
Hmm.
this myself. And so I thought, well, I'd love to commit to like doing a year. And so the thought of going to South Africa and the masters thing slightly kind of I decided to just kick it down the road a little bit and do this year in Florence. Because of the way the timings of it all worked out, I actually ended up spending most of that year after the summer course um, doing something else, and started a school in London called Lara, which is a similar drawing atelier founded by someone who'd been at the Florence Academy. And the method there was very much based on the drawing method at the Florence Academy. So when I returned to Florence, I actually went to the Florence Academy of Art.
Hmm.
Um, and you get a very similar sort of outlook there, with a few differences in thinking. So there were a couple of painters who really caught my attention, which also galvanized my interest in studying at the Florence Academy. With Jordan Sokol was one of the kind of key names there that I just looked at his work and just thought that's absolutely beautiful. And yeah, geez, I mean, he's remains one of the most sort of vibrant figures in the figure work.
Yeah,
Um,
he's incredible. I'm trying to get him on the podcast,
yeah,
but
I'm sure he'd be really
yeah.
interested.
Yeah. Him and is it Amaya? I never pronounce her name right.
Yeah, yeah.
Amaya. So did you ever cross paths with Francis Bell?
Um, I don't think I ever did in Florence, but there was a painting by her on the wall. It was a figure painting
Hmm.
at the Cecil School, and it was really, really standout. I remember looking at it and just thinking it had a kind of like naturalism to it, which was really extraordinary. Um, and I spent ages studying it and kind of the long breaks and those afternoons there.
So
So
she's
no,
a
I
bit
never.
older than you then. She went before you.
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh,
there's
okay.
actually a whole bunch of people who are now really good friends of mine who were just before me. So
Hmm.
like Routley is one, James Hayes another, um, Mark Jackson, Fran Bell. There's a whole kind of group of people who were probably 4 or 5 years ahead of me, and just a great bunch of people. And I wish in a way life had timed things slightly differently, and I was there at the same time as them. So
Yeah.
I know it would have been.
But then you wouldn't have that spectacular degree that you got.
That's true, which yeah,
Yeah.
in various ways I'll probably never use, but it was, definitely a massive highlight of my life to have had the chance to do that.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? I just interviewed dang, well, I'm gonna forget her last name. Isha. It was last week's podcast, and she's a miniature artist. She does these tiny little, like just little tiny sculptures of food, and she does maquettes, complete maquettes, little interiors, everything. And they're incredible. But her last name is Bijudkar, Isha Bijudkar. I'm probably slaughtering that. She's Indian.
Okay, well,
So
I'll
it's,
look her up.
yeah. But anyway, she got a degree. You know, she was explaining that in India, there's a lot of pressure. And this, I think this is everywhere, but it might be more the case in India. Who knows? But there was a lot of pressure to get an academic degree, even though she had inklings and some interest in art. So she went and got two degrees, one in engineering. I don't remember what the second one was. And she even went to London to get one of her degrees from India. And it was interesting because I got a comment um, about the video after where someone said, well, it's great that things are starting to change and people are starting to realize that they can, you know, I mean, I can't remember exactly how they put it, but not have to go and get a degree in something else or be pressured to get a degree in academics, but they can just go right into art now. It's not so much of a, there's not so much of a stigma as there used to be. And I thought,
Mm.
my response was, and this is what I'm thinking, I went to university and we essentially did noodle necklaces for 4 years, you know? I mean, it was like going back to kindergarten on some level for 4 years. And then, yeah, I became an artist, great. But I envy people like you that took that 4 years and got a real degree in something meaningful and then went and pursued your art. I mean, if you're gonna go get a degree, if I was gonna go get a degree again, it would be in something like that.
Very glad that I did that particular subject rather than, I mean, I at one point was going to do English and or history.
I just have to take a minute to thank each one of my generous patrons for your part in keeping this podcast going. I could not continue to do it without you, so thank you so much. If you're not a patron yet, but you love the show and you listen regularly, please consider becoming a patron. It's really easy to do and it doesn't have to break the bank. Just head over to theundrapedartist.com and click on the link Be My Patron on Podbean. And then choose a monthly donation amount that fits your budget. It's that simple. And to thank you for your generous donations, once you've reached $100 in total contributions, send me an email to theundrapedartist@gmail.com and I will send you one of our spectacular Undraped Artist aprons.
Um, and I'm really glad that I did do Arcananth because the fact of it is that I might not have enjoyed it in the way that I did had it been another subject. And I'm certainly at this point quite unlikely to be using that degree as a kind of like entry to applications to jobs. So the value that I'm taking from it is very much based on what I learned there. Um, and for sure it is artistically it has been a big thought in my mind that I don't want to waste the years that I spent doing that. And there is a huge amount, I think, to um, thinking about the reasons that people started to make artworks in the first instance. Our brains evolved in a certain manner, and the outcome was something that we now call art. I very much doubt back then they would have thought of it as art in the way that we do. But I think it is worth knowing that early forms of creativity were quite consistent across the world. So there are cultures from Australia, cultures from Africa, cultures from Europe and Indonesia, China, and there are certain motifs that you see repeated. These are completely different cultures, but certain things crop up again and again. So they would be certain animals, certain but not all species of animal, therianthropes, which are these kind of half transformed figures, so humans transformed into animals. There are geometric forms, so ladders, zigzags, lines connecting points to points, finger dots, handprints, hand stencils. It's almost as if these cultures are communicating to each other and one with another, but almost certainly that wouldn't have been the case. So why is it that there is such consistency across the globe? And, these I don't know the answer, but it is an interesting question for sure. One person, there's a few people. Well, one theory on it is that the output of those kind of motifs is related to the way the human brain is wired. So certainly in the case of San Bushmen in Southern Africa, a lot of that early art was related to their experiences of the spirit world, which they would get to by doing trance dances. So they would dance around in a circle for a number of hours and kind of go into an altered state of consciousness. And for them, they would feel a kind of potency boiling in their stomachs. They would get up through their spine, out a hole on the top of their head. And then they go on a kind of journey. And when they wake up, the stories would be manifested into paintings in one way or another. So the paintings weren't made in any old locations. They were very specific shelters that they made paintings in. So the fact that the motifs and the images are quite similar in different parts of the world might mean that is the way our brains think when we are in an altered state of consciousness. You just see those kind of geometric forms. You know how it feels when you're about to faint and your kind of vision goes a bit, and it's
I've never fainted. I don't know how it feels.
You know, you.
No, maybe I should try it.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, give it a whirl. But so when you close your eyes really hard, you get that sort of static.
Yeah.
There's a suggestion that possibly those forms are in some way related to that experience. But I have no idea. But the fact of it, there's just so much in the study of early art forms that stays with me now, and I think about it all the time. When I'm making my own images, why really do I want to make this? What am I communicating? What kind of an experience do I want to be kind of getting at? The degree remains very large in my mind.
Yeah, I'm really envious. This seems like a really interesting degree. Coincidentally, my wife, she loves to hike and camp and stuff, and she and a bunch of girlfriends just went down to southern Utah. And I don't know if you're aware, but southern Utah has a lot of petroglyphs. Like, yeah, there's a ton of them. And I just realized my voice isn't very loud. Let me get my speaker up, or my microphone up a little higher. But some of them are so strange. It's like aliens, or it's like they're rendering aliens or something. And I couldn't possibly imagine what it is they're going for. I pulled some up. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on it. And because they're so bizarre. And I wonder if you see things like this in Africa. Let's see. So there was one in particular where it looked like an alien, and it was here. Let me pull up my screen here. I know this is, I know, I realize this is about painting, but this is so fascinating, this stuff. Let's see here. Okay, like this kind of stuff.
Mm.
Like what is going on? It looks like this figure has antenna on its head, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
They just have the strangest, well, that's obviously animals and some of it's obviously costume and stuff, but yeah, the strangest imagery. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. I can't even imagine what it would be like to study that for 4 years. That seems
Well,
so
so
fascinating.
so I've not studied this specifically, but I can convey to you the experience of studying it from someone, who does know what they're looking at, and they would tend to point out just details and the kind of there would be relevance to virtually everything in this image. So, the sort of squiggling lines underneath the kind of necklace here, then pointing out the sort of shape of the shoulders and the arms, and the fact that the left hand shoulder, there's another arm from another figure is just touching it. Is it relevant that that figure is touching that there? In Southern Africa, you find images not quite as sort of geometric as this, but um, you would find images where there would be lines that would sort of touching the feet of elands and then touching the feet of some of the people. And you would get these kind of you would never get sort of really realistic people. The animals often would be quite realistic, but the people often wouldn't be. And there would be dots. There seem to be dots at the bottom here,
Yeah.
dots that would connect to certain areas. And sometimes, I don't know what happens around this figure, but there'll be cracks, and sometimes you'll get lines running in and out of cracks. So effectively, like, there's so much detail in these images, and
And do you
what
think it's
cosmology
always
is behind it
intentional?
is.
Do you think from what you've learned is the consensus that none of this is just random graffiti from some ancient teenagers, that everything on the wall has some cultural significance?
Well, I'd be very surprised if there wasn't some significance behind it. You do get graffiti, maybe not from this kind of time, but like in Southern Africa, you'd find rock shelters with sand painting along the shelter, and then you would find something that is clearly more modern and is a kind of
No, no,
form of
no. I mean
graffiti.
ancient graffiti. Graffiti meaning that
Yeah.
it's more just a bunch of teenagers rebelling and drawing on cave walls out of boredom rather than having some cultural significance at the time.
Well, so one thing to think about is the like in Paleolithic France, in Chauvet, which is a very famous cave. There's a segment of wall where there are lions superimposed one on the another. So there's a kind of charcoal drawing lion heads, and you get they're kind of almost sort of layered on top of each other, and you get a bunch of rhinos with multiple horns. They carbon dated one of these lions and then carbon dated the one that it was overlapping. And there was a difference of 4 to 5 thousand years
No
between
way.
those drawings. And honestly, it looks like it could have been made by the same hand. So that makes you wonder, like, how were they learning that technique to produce an image which is really consistent with something that's been there for, I mean, 4 to 5 thousand years. That's an extraordinary amount of time when you think of like Western
Yeah.
history. Um, to produce something that looked like it could have been done in the same moment. And given the expanse of time that you're talking about, there are relatively few paintings. So, what were the conditions under which someone was allowed to make a picture? Where did they train? How did they learn to do it? And why don't those examples survive? Um, Probably the answer to that is that they would have been done outside where they'd be exposed to the climate, and they don't exist anymore. And they do exist in the caves because it's a very stable environment. But with regards to the one you've just shown me, I would suggest that there almost certainly is a huge amount of consideration behind everything you're looking at there.
Yeah.
Um,
Man, now you got me wanting to go get a degree. I mean, look at this. What's with
yeah,
these giant
amazing.
feet? What could that possibly represent?
Yeah.
So interesting.
But like it's in Australia in the Kimberleys, there's some Aboriginal painting, and I have a feeling that some of those locations, the experience of seeing them is sort of relevant to their creation. So they depict a story of some sort, and there would be sort of songs and dances that would go with that story. So you'd be experiencing the story and the music with it and the visuals. It would sort of be like a cinematic experience in some ways.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but
I can see why
yeah,
you enjoyed it so much. You seriously got me wanting to go back to school just to study this. It's such an interesting subject. Well, so you started to talk about how it influences your own work and how it makes you think about making art. Maybe you could expound on that a little bit more.
so recently, I've been thinking much more about how figuration can work with more of the abstract qualities. So, you know, for me, my approach to painting is very much based on the naturalistic impression of someone being there.
Mm-hmm.
But visually, I find pictures are um, able to kind of get at ideas which are so symbols, for example, something that exists in painting a lot. I like to be relatively light touch with, so I don't like to be too heavy-handed with symbols. It's just my own sensibility, my own feelings for them. But I I do think there are certain ways of getting at an idea where the naturalistic impression of someone being there is not necessarily the best way of conveying that idea. So sometimes, I find that there is the option of overlaying a few sort of abstracted sort of marks onto a picture, which for me has the ability to sort of suggest an alternative narrative to the initial impact of the painting.
Hmm.
Um, so, one painting I think of a lot in that context is um, Holbein's Ambassadors, where it has this anamorphic skull stretched out across the
Right.
bottom of the two ambassadors there. And that's an amazing picture for symbolism. There's a table that they're sort of next to, and then it's got various sort of layers, sort of levels of sort of achievement in life, sort of academic thinking and religious principles and so on. And then there's this stretched out skull, which looks so contrasting to the aesthetic of the picture. But I don't know much about it, to be honest. But I do gather that the skull gets at the fact that death is just experienced from another reality. And so too with that picture, to see the skull in proportion, you stand to the side of the painting, you
Oh,
see
I
it
never
in
made that
proportion.
connection of that symbolic connection.
Um,
Hmm.
and that to me really speaks of the considered potential of sort of playing with the kind of abstracted realism, and getting at a sort of another level of an idea. I think that portrait is really sort of furthered by the presence of that weird skull.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I love all that sort of thing. Um, and with my own work, I will sort of fit in the odd note, which might kind of get at that sort of abstract symbolism.
Hmm. But you say you're not heavy-handed in it, so are you looking for symbols that only you understand, or are you actually trying to communicate with your audience?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think there is a balance between that, being sort of so mystic with a symbol that really only you will know what it means, versus having something that's readable from the audience's perspective. Um, I did a painting of a friend of mine called Mark Jackson, and it's a picture I feel really proud of.
Can we pull that
Um,
up? Is it on your website?
I think so.
Let's see.
A while back. It was a while back.
Now, which one is it?
Can you scroll down? Maybe it's not. Oh no, it is up there. Sorry, up to the right, next to the girl with the dog, and down one. sorry, one across to the right, and one up.
Right here?
That's the one, yeah.
That one? Okay. Oh yeah, that's intense, dude.
But this was it's a life-size picture, so it's a large canvas. I spent some time with Jacko in his studio, um, and he has a fascinating life behind him. He was in the parachute regiment and uh, had a really interesting time in the army, but had a parachute accident and smashed his hips and
Mm.
broke his leg, and it effectively led to his leaving the army probably before his time there. Um, and he is one of the most brilliant and energetic, kind people I know. I knew him because he went to Florence after his accident and picked up painting at Charles Cecil and then latterly sculpture and then became a full-time sculptor. So this opportunity to paint his portrait was kind of born from the fact I was sharing a studio with him for a couple of months working on a different picture, and I had a spare canvas, and so I painted his portrait during that time, and it was freezing in this barn. I remember it was snowy outside, and the studio was filled with some old sculptures that he'd made, and there's one sculpture which was of an archer, and the clay had been cast. The commission had been completed. It was just there, and the clay was kind of falling to bits, and it cracked across the hips and across the heart. So it felt apposite to his injuries.
Mm.
And so I cast the shadow over the leg that was particularly badly hurt, and then in the background, he'd always had this sort of vision of making a sculpture of Cain and Abel, kind of for its connections to the origins of conflict, which is an obviously poignant subject for a soldier. And it hadn't been made, but I invented a suggestion in the shadow. And if you can see, there's a suggestion of a hand reaching up towards a figure looming over. And then there's a jawbone, which the jawbone is sometimes depicted in paintings from the past as the kind of object that the the killing was done with. And so that, arguably that is a symbol which is possibly a bit too niche to really be understood. But
Mm.
I, I nevertheless feel that the context of it being made, this painting, it felt right to the kind of experience of being with him and communicating these subjects.
Yeah,
So it
those
was
are great symbols. They're you're right. Some people might not catch it. I wouldn't have. I think the jawbone, given enough time, I might have made that connection. But with a short description, it really makes the painting so much more meaningful. So who owns this painting now?
Oh, I've got it in the studio. It's massive and it's obviously very gloomy. So
Yeah,
I'm not sure there's a natural home for it other than my studio.
man, it's a
But
great piece.
it's a painting that I really love.
No kidding. That should be in a museum. And what's beautiful, you've just got these incredible textures and brushwork throughout. So tell me about how you moved from studying in Florence to actually making this thing happen, to starting a full-time career as a painter.
Um, well, I'd studied painting for 3 years. I was conscious of the need to um, make a move away from Florence, and I felt that the world of portrait painting was, in a sense, the most obvious thing to do in London. And I got a commission uh, from a British Army regiment to do a painting for them. And that sort of effectively was the kind of the first moment where I sort of had to think about how do I price a picture? What do I do to kind of do this professionally? Um, and so I started taking on commissions, and there were some private portrait commissions, after a little bit of time, I had a conversation with a gallery that specialized in commissioned portraiture, and they invited me to show with them, and so they're called fine art commissions, and I took part in an exhibition there, and gradually they kind of ordered my um, time and schedules so that I could take on commissions and do it in a manner which was kind of more orderly than I think I would have naturally been inclined towards. So I definitely came from Florence with this perspective of having a model there. You sit them down for as many sittings as you need to do the picture, and I had really very little idea how you would price a painting, how you would communicate to clients, and the gallery really helped at sort of building my confidence about how procedurally it would best be done. And they also had so much experience with the commissioning process. They've seen some real horror shows as well as some real successes, and so were able to a little bit guide me as to um, commissions that are worth taking and commissions that maybe are not. And also, do you lay out a contract ahead of time? Do you take a deposit? If so, what percentage? This is all stuff that I would have, free-handed and given my best shot at. But for sure, that gallery helped me with that in the initial stages.
And
so
they keep you busy basically full time, or do you have other sources of income?
no, painting is it. I spend my year painting. I lately have been sort of allocating myself more time away from portrait commissions to kind of build up an exhibition of work to eventually sort of have a show of speculative paintings, which I feel are kind of communicating some of the thoughts I've wanted to get at artistically outside of the world of portraiture. So I will take a limited number of commissions a year to buy myself time to do the rest.
So you said that when you left Florence and came back to England, that portrait painting was I think you said, most obvious direction to go. Why do you say that?
Because a commission sort of had come to me, and it seemed like a ball to roll with.
Okay.
Wasn't really sure what else I would do. I mean, I had done a little bit of student level teaching in my last year at the Florence Academy, but so teaching is obviously a way of earning as well. But I figured that so long as I had a portrait commission to do, I kind of wanted to invest more time in that area. And I found that it became increasingly a quite sort of lovely experience to get to spend time with people in professions that I'd never spent any time in and knew nothing about. And often, they're people at the tops of their trees, and fascinating people to spend time with. So I formerly really enjoyed painting portraits as well. It took me a little bit of time before I felt comfortable feeling that I had a meaningful income from it. But I had a few people to look up to. So there were some painters who were already well established in London when I arrived. And seeing them working in their studios and the way in which they got into the studios, it felt like a constant sort of search for how do you get your foot in a sort of proper painting studio in London, because it's difficult and it's expensive, and there are very few of them. Um, for me, I joined a roster of other artists keeping their ear to the ground for studio options, and I spent a lot of time on Apple Maps 3D function facing south, so I could see all the north-facing windows and just scrolling across London in the 3D format, so I could see the buildings. And the studio windows are quite obvious, and so whenever one popped up, I'd write it down on the map and reach out to the local estate agent and say, look, if this ever comes up for rent, can you just let me know? And sometimes they would, largely like it's London, so they're impossibly expensive. But I did get into a lovely little studio, which had a north-facing window. Admittedly, that north-facing window was looking onto a brick wall, but there was a little kind of from one angle you get some sky, and it served me really well.
Is that where you are now?
No, I left there about 5 years ago.
Okay, and do you work out of your home now?
I've now moved to the countryside. I'm down in Wiltshire, the Wiltshire-Dorset border, and I'm renting a barn, which is now my studio. And it's great. I'm absolutely loving it. I've feared I would. There are a few things I do miss about London, namely the kind of connection to my painter friends. Right next door neighbors with Jamie Rowley for a couple of years, and then that was an incredibly rewarding time. And I do miss that very much. But this barn, has its positives. It's massive compared to the space I was in before. So I feel like there's no limitation on the sizes of canvases, and being able to step back really properly from your paintings changes the way you see the big shapes in them hugely. And a lot of my painting is done now at a big distance, and I feel like it helps.
How big is the barn?
So width would be about 6 meters, and then length would be about 20 meters.
Okay. So about 60 feet by 18 feet, I guess. I don't know. I think a meter is approximately 3 feet. I don't know, but I think it is. Okay.
Great space.
Yeah, that's a pretty good sized space. That's great. So tell me a little bit about your process. I mean, well, first your professional process. How do you go about making a painting as it relates to working with clients and so on and so forth?
I first conversations with a client is really trying to understand what they're after, their situation, who they are, and what would be the right painting for them. I mean, sometimes people are pretty sort of on the fence about the whole process. Other times they have a very clear idea. Other times it's not commissioned by them. It's kind of commissioned by an institution or something. So it's all relevant to the picture you make in the first instance. But I always try to meet up with them first and really kind of get a sense of that. If I'm lucky, I'll spend really quite a good bit of time with people beforehand. And that will really kind of help me make up my mind as to what painting I want to make. Because the thing that I will be wanting to maximize on during the process of painting them is trying to paint the experience of being with them, and communicate that. Now there are, I feel like, two different approaches to painting which come into portraiture. And one is where, and Freud would be a great example of this, where someone steps into a studio and steps into the kind of like lens through which Freud views everybody, and they step into his world and they come out as a Freud portrait. And then the other side would be painters who don't have necessarily such a strong mannerism to their painting, but the experience of being with those pictures is sort of somehow born of the subject. So, so a painter like Velasquez, you feel like you're kind of with the person, and for me, that's an approach to portraiture where they have obviously stepped into the world of Velasquez, and they, Velasquez has done his job with them. But then I feel like there's more to it. I feel like there's a sense where the character and the nature of the person has been strong enough in Velasquez's experience of spending time with them that somehow the picture has a bit of that embodied in it too. And you feel like the sitter is on the side of the canvas. So not that my work connects anywhere close to that, but that concept, that way of thinking about painting, is something that I work on a lot. So trying to work out how to paint a portrait of someone in a manner that feels true to what it's like to have a conversation with them and to be in the room with them. The way someone holds themselves, the way they will act is is something that you have to, I think, be listening out for and not consciously looking for. You don't sort of watch for stuff particularly, but you just sort of, I feel like, try to remain sort of conscious of how I feel when I'm with someone, and that there is something in that can resonate when you're cycling through ideas for a painting in your mind. And what I tend to find is that I'll be cycling through different compositions and feels of a painting in my head before I've made it, and at some point there will be a sort of sense of the painting I want to make that really resonates as true to how it is to be with that person. And then that's the moment at which I want to compose the painting and have them into the studio and try and capture whatever that feeling was. And then as for the process of painting the picture, it differs from person to person. And sometimes I can have them for a number of sittings. Sometimes a client won't allow me many sittings at all by nature of who they are, what they're doing, or just the diary work particularly. And I've had to adapt my process a bit to accommodate for that. But so that my method of painting each picture is a little bit different, but it's always with the same kind of focused goal for the picture as communicating that sort of experience that resonates. I feel like the words I'm way I'm explaining myself is possibly a bit sort of
no, it makes perfect
confusing
sense.
/ boring to listen to, but
and I not at all, and I relate to it 100%. The question though that I have is, if the process varies, which any portrait painter would understand this, I certainly do. The process varies depending on the client, and you get one client that gives you no time, so you clearly have to use photography to work with them, and then another client that gives you an abundance of time. How are you able to apply everything you just described? Being with the person, seeing how they move and how they react to situations and so on. How do you apply that if someone doesn't give you any time?
Well, if someone gives you very little time, you're limited, right, with what you can do in that respect. The process of painting it can allow you to imagine elements within the picture. So, even if you have a single session with someone, you might be given a kind of a look, or they might have some kind of clothing or something that it does sort of like resonate with you, and then that the painting will be framed. If you have a lot of time with someone, I feel like you can get more out of a person in a picture, but that moreness might be to do with the fact that your experience of them has changed over the sittings, or maybe that if you know someone, then you've got all sorts of ways of thinking about someone. Like I recently painted my wife, and I've got lots of ways of conceiving of how to paint her, and you just end up having to choose one of those narratives in a way, and sort of go with that. So yeah, so I think the process is tested when you have very little time with someone. And yeah, for me, what I do in that situation is that I will take video on my iPhone and also take photographs. and then paint a color study whilst I do have them. So that offers me three things. Firstly, the photographs offer me a high quality image, which may or may not work out as being useful compositionally for a painting. The color study will offer me an opportunity to kind of capture the sense of them being there, so the big light effect on them, which doesn't tend to be captured particularly well either by video or by photography. Ditto with color, which is I find that there's no camera I've ever used that has kind of captured the relationships of colors in the way that's actually true to how you experience them personally. So I find that color study is absolutely key. And then so the video that I take is actually more of the reference that I'll be using, to make the painting, because what it allows me is to scroll very slowly through the video and just find those little moments where, maybe an eyebrow just shot up for half a second and probably have missed it if you're taking a photograph.
That's
but
interesting.
it's film.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes I'll cycle something, sort of loop it. So it can be like a sort of 5-minute bit of video where someone's posing in a way that I really liked. And the conversation I was having, like, it's kind of worth having it moving rather than as a still. Other times, someone's hair has just fallen in a great way, or their shirt is moved in a manner that's going to work in a certain section of the painting, then I'll pause that and just have that as a still to work from.
And this is all
But
from your iPhone.
Yeah. And I do have a sort of swanky camera as well, but what I find is the issue for that is that it will be capturing such a high resolution that it can kind of throw the way in which I want to paint the picture in a way you sort of see a bit too much, like a resolution image. So effectively the process, like using all of these, is doing my best with a single sitting, for example, to replicate what I would be doing over a much longer period of time of painting it from life, but always with the kind of, like, in your mind's eye, the approach that you would be taking to capture them sitting there in reality. Trying not to have that sort of the anchor that can come with painting from a photograph.
That's a really interesting process. So if you have this great high-res photo that may or may not be compositionally useful, but it still says a lot about the likeness of the person, right? And then you've got this video which shows you their mannerisms and their I can't think of the word, the way they move, their idiosyncrasies. So how do you combine the two? Do you use the reference, the good reference for general structural and anatomical information, and then sort of throw in these little things like the lifted eyebrow and the little smirk or whatever?
So the initial drawing onto the canvas, I'd be using I say it is literally a little bit different for each picture. Sometimes what that video allows is say there's this shirt, for example, turned one way, the angle of this might be looking really good in relation to the angle of my jaw, so I would want to kind of get that as part of the big composition. And you can sort of pause that moment and sort of knit that into the painting right at the start. But the sort of big shapes, I think I would take from something that is going to be sort of still structurally, and then I would be using the color study and the video to kind of get the impression of someone for actually advancing the picture. So I'm not too kind of like worried about the sort of specific shapes of the kind of edge of the eye if I'm working from a photograph, because any painter knows that feeling. If you're working from a photograph, you're just making it more and more like the photo, and that's not really what you're wanting to do as a painter. Necessarily. At least it's not what I'm sort of aiming to do. So consciously keeping a bit of sort of options open for yourself. The way I tend to build a portrait is that I don't go specific early. I work the sort of drawing out as well as I can proportionally. It'll probably be a few sort of umber lines, and to sort of establish the kind of key locations of things. But I will paint the darkest darks a fair bit lighter than they'll end up being. I'll paint the lightest lights a fair bit below where they'll end up being, and keep the brushwork relatively loose so that I can feel I can change things. I don't feel too committed to one particular passage. So, if they're if I'm working with a feature like, say, sort of an eye socket right at the start, and I've not established how I want the rest of the painting to kind of come together, I, by experience, will have worked myself into problems because I might really like a section that is meaning that I'm basically sort of committing to a painting that isn't going to work out. But
Right.
I just wasted so much time committing to pictures on the basis of a still image, that you know I know in my sort of core when I'm starting out a picture that I need to have that freedom to change it, to sort of scrape stuff down and mess around. Otherwise it just can go wrong.
So what you're saying is what you wouldn't do is just take out this photo, this high res photo, and window paint, just like nail down the eyes before you've established the entire composition, the gesture of the painting, the feeling of the figure, the emotion in the painting. So you would keep it loose until you're able to combine all of your references into as perfect as possible of a painting, and then you start going into the details at that point.
Yeah. So, in one respect, I'm just sort of thinking, what would it be like to watch me paint? I do tend to paint the head first, but I would do so only after I've established how I want the rest of the picture to be.
Right.
I've done the rest of the picture in line. It doesn't have to be super specific line, but like I would know where I was going to go with it. I don't like to get myself into a cycle of restarting and restarting too many times on a single canvas, because I quite like the way that paint goes down onto a primer. I find too many layers of paint changes the nature, and it can be nice in some locations if you want a lot of texture, say in fabric or in sort of in pastos in the head. But for the most part, I want to feel I have control over the fluidity of the paint. So I think the kind of exact sort of approach to painting is basically based on the sort of like way of thinking where you are conceiving of the whole picture at once.
Mm-hmm.
You're actually doing one bit of the picture, of course, but
all right, you can't paint everywhere at once. You have to do something first, right? Yeah.
I mean, I spent ages feeling really confused about that in Florence, where you are told to cover the canvas before moving on to the next stage, and that means head, figure, background, get it all down there in a sort of foggy form and refined. And I had read a lot about a few 19th century painters' approach to painting. Sargent was a big inspiration technically with the kind of descriptions of the way he would do it, and that involved painting in the background into the hair, and then there'd be a sort of like a mannequin's head with unspecific features. And I spent ages feeling really confused by that, because I can see that in his alla prima portraits that certainly is how it would have been done. But for the more developed paintings, it just doesn't make sense when you're working on layer upon layer to do that each and every time. So I've sort of ended up at the position where you sort of feel like you're bearing in mind that way of conceiving of a painting, and then working more specifically, not window shading per se, but but painting as much as you can in a single area and trying to complete it with regards to the drawing and the sort of texture of the paint, but with the darkest darks being quite significantly lighter than where you ended up being, so that once you've say painted this beard area and you're happy with the structure of the mouth, then you just push those those darks a bit darker. You know, bring those lights up. Ideally, while the paint's still wet. And I found it was impossible to do that at a high level everywhere in a single session. And I would, you know, think
Especially
maybe
large scale, which you're usually painting large
exactly
scale. Yeah.
large scale. It just doesn't make sense.
I
And
don't
you know,
think Sargent would have done that either. It doesn't make any sense.
no, I don't think he did. Certainly on the big pictures. I think there's probably quite a bit of reworking. And I think also there's so much about him because at that time he was clearly such a celebrity that people would feverishly sort of record everything that they could learn about his technique. Not that many people got to see him do it. And I suspect he probably changed his method quite a bit over his career.
This episode is brought to you in part by Rosemary Brushes. If you're one of my listeners who's a professional artist, you're already using Rosemary Brushes. But for the rest of you, come on. Take your work a little more seriously. Stop buying the other brands. It's just not worth it. Every now and then you may get lucky and buy a good brush from another brand, but use the brand that professionals like myself are using. Go to rosemaryandco.com, link in the description or the show notes, and get yourself some quality brushes before your next painting.
So, yeah, so in other words, my way of thinking about painting is conceiving of the whole and then painting specifically.
Yeah. Don't you find that you not have to, but it makes more sense to do the heads first and get a solid likeness before you commit to everything else? Because if let's say you do the body and you've committed to a scale of the body, then you have to get a good likeness of a head between two lines, the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. And that is much harder to do than to just paint a head and then use the head to measure out the body.
Totally. So I genuinely feel really uncomfortable proceeding with the rest of the picture until I know I'm happy with at least the fundamental of the head. I want to feel that I have a future with that head. And you know, I probably do bin half of the paintings that I make, and restart them entirely. So it's you know, it is a really really difficult thing, and I find it gets harder the more time I spend doing it. But and I want the head to be really reading effectively. And then once I feel that that head has a future and I can develop it another stage further, then I'll move on to, you know, massing out the rest of the canvas. Head and hands, those two things are at least drawn and painted in the first stage well, then I feel comfortable moving into the rest. If I haven't done that, then I feel a degree of anxiety and
I'm the same way. Totally. Yeah. It's totally the same way. If I do a multi-figure, like I just did my family, and there were 5 heads in it, and I essentially finished all 5 heads. I mean, I got them to a certain level of completion where, as you describe, I was happy with them and comfortable with them enough to move forward. But that's all 5 heads before I really did much of anything else.
Yeah. So with multifigural paintings, I've learned to not completely finish those heads at that stage, because the broad light effect across the picture can be really different once you come to it. So you know,
you can't completely finish them, right?
Yeah, because you might realize that there's just a kind of a greenish glow that's running across the background that needs to feature in a lot of the halftones and in the, so you just need to I find I have to leave myself the option to return to the heads if I need to. Um, I I don't know about you, but I like there to be underlying texture within a head.
Mm-hmm.
So the surface level, I want to be working on top of a kind of scaffolding that exists underneath. Um,
A
but
scaffolding of texture.
yeah, kind of. So the first the first pass on the head I'll do relatively thickly. So I'll let that dry properly. And the second pass might be a little bit more kind of oily.
Right.
Um, and but it might
A
have
little fat
relatively
over
sort of like
lean, right? That's the way it should be done.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Huh.
and the trouble I find is that like if you then decide you haven't quite nailed it, is then when you go back into it with a panic and the process has been lost a little bit,
Yeah.
and then you get the practice lean principle and you're feeling terrible, and then the client, you're conscious they're watching you, and you need to tell them that you're going to restart the whole thing.
Oh
That's
gosh, that's so
I've had a little bit.
stressful. I've had that happen too. Yeah, I had working in front of the client can be so stressful because especially if they're a client that's a little insecure about how they look and every time they come and look at the canvas, you feel like you're breaking their heart a little bit. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. But I
A
certainly
friend
have.
of a friend of mine has a great story about this. He was painting someone's portrait, and it was over the course of a couple of years. And she was from the States and would come see him every now and then when she was in the UK for sittings for this painting. And every time he got to the end of the session, and I thought, yeah, I'm happy with that, and nearly there. One more, perhaps one more sitting. And she'd go away for a few months and come back, and he'd get the canvas out and say, it's just not quite. That doesn't quite look like them. It's weird. I thought I had it last time. And anyway, it transpired that she'd been having plastic surgery a few different times over the course of those 2 years. So he was
No
kind of
way.
facing a evolving face,
Oh my
which
gosh, that's crazy. I have almost the same experience, but mine is much sadder. I actually had a client, it's actually quite sad. I actually had a client who had cancer and they were losing weight from
yeah,
sitting to sitting. And they from sitting to sitting, I think they lost like 50 pounds overall. Oh, it was brutal.
that's
And
really hard. I don't
yeah,
know
it
what
was
I'd.
tough. It's more tough for them, of course. But they ended up
Yeah,
it's a really unfortunate story. He ended up passing before we even finished the portrait.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really, really sad story. Good man. It was great to. Speaking
Yeah,
of, you were talking earlier about getting to know people, and that at least this is what I think you were expressing, that one of the joys that you have about being a portrait painter is getting to know your sitter. And that was one of those experiences where it was almost a spiritual experience working with this guy over that period of time, even though we never finished it, and
yeah,
just being with him as his life was slowly concluding and being that small part of it. That was a really enriching experience to do
yeah,
that. They actually had two clients pass away in the middle of a portrait. I don't know. I must be like the Grim Reaper or something.
yeah. Grief, not gonna have a portrait done by you. Definitely.
I know. Seriously. That's dang. That's true. Yeah.
uh,
Anyway. Yeah.
yeah,
That,
it is.
go
It
ahead.
is. There have been a few people I've painted that the time I've spent with them has been really moving. There's one person I painted who'd recently lost her father, and I can't tell you how struck I was by her determination to not let the sadness of it get the best of her. Um, it happened relatively soon before the painting began, and she committed to learning French, to running a marathon, and writing a book that she'd wanted to write. And there was this kind of that was a kind of painting that I change my approach to how I would want to paint her. So for example, I uh, wanted to kind of get at that private sense of consolation that she was nurturing for herself. So, smiling, for example, with your eyes down, I feel in a picture can do that a little bit because she's smiling for herself. And there are a few people, and I would say she's one of the kind of top among them, have really stayed with me as very, very impressive figures.
Hmm.
The nature of spending time with someone painting them is a little unusual, I suppose, because you spend so much time, and it is, in a sense, a picture about that moment in their life, and it can become evident over time, over those sittings, as you sort of piece out more to do with their life.
Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting you study anthropology because as you're talking, I'm thinking, in being a portrait painter, it's almost like you're experiencing anthropology on a micro level with these people. It's just one little slice of humanity on an intimate level for one little slice of time, and
mm,
it can be really meaningful. I mean, I've painted. Most of when I do commission portraits, it's usually families, so it's a little different than say royalty. Which, by the way, I want to talk to you about that royal portrait at some point. But occasionally I'll paint, a president of a university or a mayor or senator or something like that. It's pretty rare for me, but just because I enjoy the families more.
yeah,
But I've met some
yeah,
really interesting, really influential people that I never would have met otherwise, and it because of them needing a portrait. So it's in that sense, it's really enriching too,
mm,
to be able to meet people that are so out of your, I don't know, there's not, I won't say so out of your league, but they're just so like they're so not part of your world, and there's
mm,
no way you would ever cross paths with these people otherwise.
yeah,
So I find that kind of an exciting part of being a portrait painter as well.
yeah, totally, yeah,
Yeah.
very rewarding.
So one thing you said earlier was when you used the example of working out your mouth, and you'd like to get it to a point where you want to get those last darks and lights in while it's still wet. But then later you
Yeah.
talked about how your first layer you build up more texture, and then their second layer you go more oily and thinner on top. So which is it? Are you after alla prima, wet into wet, or are you after layers, or what combination
Yeah,
are you looking for?
so it's a little bit of both. So it's painting wet into wet, but with an intention to let the first layer dry up. I tend not to do the whole thing in one pass. Um, Ideally, two or three passes I find completes a head at its best. So yeah, what I would do would be paint it with the absolute intention to do as much as I can in a single session, but conscious that I'm probably not going to nail it in the first go. So the darkest darks I would be painting with a good degree of. So I don't know. It says I'm not sure how many of your listeners are painters themselves, but if I just sort of run through the sort of mixes I might make to paint some of the sort of shadow passages, I'd be mixing a lot of Mars brown and a bit of yellow ochre and red into that kind of ivory black to make that shadow. So I'd be keying it quite high, and would paint it as accurately as I can, with that in mind, that I'm going to probably let that dry. I find Mars brown allows ivory black to dry much better. Um, and then the second pass, so long as I'm happy with what existed before, I'd probably try and push those sort of inky dark notes to their kind of final darkness as kind of quickly as I can.
Hmm.
So I'd kind of replicate what I'd done in the first pass again, and then just kick those darks a bit darker.
Gotcha. Okay, I think it's probably it's definitely about time we looked at your art. It's been a great conversation, so we've waited probably longer than a lot of the listeners want to wait. But um, let's look at some of these portraits. I got to tell you, this one is my favorite that I've seen of yours. It is absolutely insane. I mean, it's such a gorgeous portrait. Can you tell me about this one?
Yeah, so that is a portrait of someone called Yasmina, who's Florentine, a proper Florentine, and actually models for the schools in Florence. Um, I I actually asked her to pose for this when she came to the UK. I'd reached out to this dress designer called Marika Transu, who produces extraordinary, highly sequined dresses, and asked if I might be able to borrow one to make a painting of, because I feel like her work really puts me in mind of some of the painters that I love the most, such as Klimt and Sargent, and I feel that those slightly kind of reflective fabrics, be it sequin, silk, velvet, all translate really beautifully into paint. So, in a sense, I'd actually sort of begun with the dress and for this painting. She had agreed to lend me it, and it's a very expensive item. Like I felt quite nervous when it arrived, conscious that it was a complete unique piece. And so Yasmina very graciously came to pose in it for me, and we made this painting together. And I kind of wanted to really just sort of explore firstly um, the kind of natural posing attitude that Yasmin is capable of sort of bringing a session. So she had a very kind of instinctive way of working as a model. And then the dress, there was so much in it symbolically, the dress design had put into it. And I wanted to explore how I could paint. I mean, it literally all sequins from neck downwards, right to the bottom. That's pure sequins. It's a very, very heavy thing. And if you move even just a fraction of an inch, all of the light shapes change. It all sort of twinkles and
Hmm.
like different painting every second. So trying to kind of like intellectually work out how I wanted to paint it was a good challenge. Like what I ended up doing with the dress is I painted Yasmina in the position, but the dress I then had on a mannequin
I
and
wondered
just
about that. Yeah, there's no other way you would do it except for a photo, but then you'd lose so much in a photo with a dress like that.
yeah, the photograph I did photograph, and those photos ended up being useless, frankly,
Mm-hmm.
because there's if you want to paint a dress filled with sequins, it's an absolute nightmare if you can see every sequin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the only way I felt I could paint that is having on a mannequin and standing back from it and squinting and blurring my eyes and working out what are those kind of big light shapes, and then painting those big light shapes and just etching in some sort of hashes of color through it.
Not to mention, if you photograph something with sequins, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you photographed it. I would assume that all the sequins would, every highlight would just be blown out and it would all just be
Yeah,
one big
totally.
blur of light.
Exactly that happened. So all of the kind of like drawing within the dress that they put in. So there's a kind of tree trunk down the center with this kind of ribbon wrapped around it, and then there are lots of, astrological motifs in it. All of that sort of slightly disappeared or became confused by highlights, and then it's exactly as you say,
Mm-hmm.
highlights are also exaggerated. Like I find on heads as well that when you're working from life, the highlights aren't as dramatic as they would appear in a photograph.
It's true.
So I actually like, it's one of the things like learning to paint from life, that if one is working from a photograph, I play down the highlights a bit. The highlight on the end of the nose is not as important as I used to think it was. Um,
Hmm. Yeah,
so
that's good tip.
that's that painting, and I like I tend to kind of elongate figures as well. So where Yasmina was standing in reality, there's probably an extra foot of space down to where I placed her feet in the canvas.
So you say she's maybe at 9 heads tall or something?
I don't know how many heads it is, but I definitely stretch her out a fair bit.
Yeah, that's one thing that Sargent did that's bizarre. And yet it works. It
Yeah.
always works, but he has figures that are like 10 heads tall.
Yeah, it's some of them are really, really elongated. I think there's something quite cool about it, like it's got an aesthetic all of its own. But I think it's a little bit, when you're with someone, you look someone up and down, you don't necessarily experience being with them in the way that you would if you're just observing the relative proportions of standing next to them. Because that's when you do get that perspective distortion, and the legs are relatively smaller and squatter than you would have in reality. I mean, the way that it's been taught to me is you have your model, and then you paint their head size, but you then, if you want to kind of paint down to their legs and feet, you raise them up, so you put them on a platform increasingly high, so you're kind of seeing each section of their body at a similar level, so you're not really looking down too much at their feet, kind of seeing it all on a level.
Oh, I've never heard it put
Which,
that way. I've instinctually done that myself because it just
yeah,
looks weird if you paint them as though you're standing close to them and they're essentially bent,
yeah,
right? The
exactly.
the the
Yeah,
perspective is like a curve, which is strange.
yeah.
But I've never heard
Uh,
it actually described in the way you just did.
But I mean, some painters, I love like Freud's approach to perspective, where he kind of stretches people out, but not in the way that the Sargent does. Like he's not sort of adding heads to their overall length. It's kind of like it's like a sort of fishbowl in certain paintings, right?
Yeah.
Sort of just feet sort of flow underneath you somehow. Um, and I quite like that. But it's a different way of painting. Um,
Yeah, and he's after something different than you are. It seems to me that you're really after capturing the person. And even though technically in life, when we're face to face with a person, they're distorted, but we're not looking at their whole body. I mean, our field of view is only like 60 degrees, right? So we're not
yeah,
really focused on their whole body. We don't see the distortion. So when you do a painting, if you capture that, then you've captured something that's never actually in our field of view, and it's disconcerting.
yeah, yeah, true.
Yeah. But and his paintings are a little disconcerting sometimes. But that's kind of
Yeah,
what makes them interesting.
brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, yeah, that's gorgeous. Is who owns that painting? Is that also in your studio?
I have that one, yeah.
God, you have, man, I need to get your address so I know who to rob if I ever end up in your area. Jeez, you have some treasures in there. Let's see. So I want to look at something a little more official. So let's see. This looks like a pretty official portrait. And
Yeah.
who is this?
There's someone called Richard Shelton, who's an American businessman, and actually has a house down in Dorset. And he asked me to paint his portrait a few years ago. Really lovely man, sort of brilliant, and has that kind of has a few kind of qualities that really stuck with me. One thing is like you send him an email and you'll get a response within 10 minutes.
Hmm.
Um,
What's he do for
and
a living?
he has he's a financier, so he's got his own investment company.
Hmm.
And then from that, he's kind of built a number of different companies doing different things. But he's a multi-business owner.
That's what I'm talking
Um,
about. So I have this ongoing debate with my wife and various other people who I'm, relatively close to, as to whether or not an artist is blue collar or white collar. I see myself as a blue collar person because I do craft. It's a craft, right? I don't
mm,
see it as any different than building a piece of furniture.
yeah,
It's just a different medium, or being a sculptor or whatever. But a lot of people perceive it as white collar, being a painter.
mm,
I don't at all. And this to me is white collar. This is like these people, the office types, the ones who are moving a lot of money around,
Yeah.
managing people, so on and so forth. So as me who perceives myself as a blue collar person, I don't it like I said earlier, I just can't see myself ever running into these people if I weren't painting their portrait.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like a part of the experience. I mean, most people who are in a position to commission portraits, maybe that probably does sway more white collar, and then the the work that you're inclined to make as an artist might be more blue collar. I mean, the distinction, I think, is a little bit defined by the nature of the commissioning process. Um, I think I've definitely met people that I wouldn't naturally run into um, in any circle of my own
Mm-hmm.
by um, and this would be an example. I'm not been born with a great financial mind. I don't have a natural set of sort of business instincts. Um, Spending time with Richard, who really does, um, massively changes my perspective on you know what should you be sort of aiming to achieve with the business, what should you be aiming to achieve in your own sort of financial goals. It's been a real education. And a lot of these guys, and I'd say he's an example, is someone who's kind of reached the top of his tree and is willing to give his time and thoughts to your ideas. I've had a lot of creative ideas, which some of which are completely like not worth pursuing, but it's people like him who will tell me that.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, so I've got a lot of value from just kind of getting to know people through painting their portraits, and then you know I've had some lovely sort of experiences with them.
Yeah, it
Uh,
really is priceless. All right, let's see. Okay, so that whole subject
the painting just to your immediate right is the one of my wife,
to my
and
right
there's
here, no,
no, no, to the left of that. You were just over it. The blue and the
oh, okay.
orange.
I was like, she's with another man. What's that all about? Okay, which
um,
one? This your wife and her mother,
that's
or
my wife and her mum, and that's my most recent picture, which for once I feel really sort of happy with. I'm virtually always unhappy with my paintings after I've done them. But
that's
uh,
gorgeous.
this I'm delighted with. It's another sort of life-size picture, so it is big. Um, and I wanted to paint Izzy and her mum because they have a really close friendship. As mother and daughter, um, it's a really beautiful thing to watch. I mean, she calls Claire every night, and they are very, very sort of on the same wavelength with their sense of humor and interests, and it's just a delight. And I felt that I wanted to paint that relationship because we spoke about how you can see you have lots of ways of narrating people that you know well, and for me that's one element of it is kind of the life that is spent with Izzy. One part of it is witnessing their relationship, and we I kind of felt that when we discovered we were going to have a baby together, that was quite a nice moment to paint that dynamic. Um, and the picture that I wanted to make, I wanted to kind of firstly get that sense of connection, but also the kind of the nature of her being a mum, and Izzy being an expectant mother, because she's always going to be Claire's child in the same way that Casper's always going to be our boy. And actually, during these sittings, it was during a little period of time where we'd been told some sort of worrying news about the pregnancy. It ended up not being uh, anything concerning in the end, but at the time we had this period of time where we were really worried that there was going to be a certain outcome with the baby,
Mm.
and and Claire was there, and I just remember thinking that she was just so present in a way that I just couldn't help but admire. So I wanted to try and I spent a long time with them working out this pose. We tried loads of things because I don't know what your experience is when you're composing two people together. It can be oddly difficult to get a sort of a natural sense of connection between them because
Yeah.
three is great to compose with. You've got loads of options, but two, it's quite difficult not just to have two sort of like figures like sort of sitting next to each other. And like, I had them sort of sitting down on a bench, standing next to each other, and like nothing quite sort of captured that feeling of like maternal connection until like the break where I said, "Can we just like have a cup of coffee?" And Izzy sort of laid back, and it wasn't quite this pose, but like the whole sort of feel changed. And sort of lent into Claire, and it was just sort of more of a sort of natural hug. So when we then sort of like started again trying to find a pose, that's kind of where I took it. And then talking with a few kind of abstracting elements, I didn't want to paint the picture as a completely naturalistic scene with with figures within an environment, because I wanted to get at the nature of that generational shift. So the little bunny rabbit teddy that Izzy has is a teddy that she's had throughout her life called Rabzit, and it's either still in our bed. And then I took the scan of the baby and stretched it out a bit, a bit like that Holbein ambassador's skull, so you see it from the side.
Oh my
Because
gosh, that's what that is.
yeah, so my thought being is that like if that skull is intended to be the sort of unknowable perspective of dying, then surely coming into the world is as unknowable as that as well. And so I thought it would feel right. You can sort of see a skull in a sense in it, to sort of view that scan from another perspective too. And then I'm not sure you can really see it in the picture, but I put a handprint, my own handprint,
I
half
see it.
over.
I do see it. Yeah. Dude, I thought that was fabric this whole time. I thought you just had some fabric stretched, but now I can't unsee it. Dude, that's brilliant. Is it just me or the rest of you guys also get weirdly excited when you order new paint? Because I don't know about you, but when I get paint in the mail, it feels like Santa just dropped my Christmas presents off at my doorstep. With Vasari paint, my paint of choice and the podcast sponsor, it's even more exciting. And let me show you why. Because when Vasari shows up, it comes in this incredible box where each tube lays in this little compartment perfectly formed around the tube in this nice soft foam. And it's surrounded by velvet, red velvet. Now you got to ask yourself, if a paint comes so carefully protected and surrounded by red velvet, you got to wonder if this paint is worthy of royalty. It is. Vasari is. So if you haven't tried Vasari, you're seriously missing out. And the thing about Vasari, it's not only the best paint out there, it's also made by an incredible company that's been around for 30 years and knows its customer by name. Do yourself a favor, go to VasariColors.com and order yourself some for your next painting. It's just how do I put it? It's just obvious enough.
Because so that's a lot of painting and overpainting, trying to work out how to balance that stuff. So the background's got through a worrying number of different versions, kind of to the point where I was worrying I was going to have to scrape it all down. But I ended up going with this kind of neutral gray almost. It's kind of like a greeny.
The hands are remarkable. Hands are also tricky to pose. Especially when they're clasping like that, and you just somehow you created this beautiful grip between her and her mother. That's just perfect. So perfect. But it's funny. My wife has a blankie. She calls it her blankie. Yeah. And when we first got married, she was 23, I was 22, and she had this thing, and I'm like, "What's this?" She's like, "Oh, it's the one I was wrapped in when I was born." Well, now, and it was a little raggedy then, because it's 23 years old.
Yeah.
And she slept with it, and it was just something that give her comfort. We're 50 now. and she still has to have it under her face when
Still
she
there.
just puts it right under her cheek when she goes to sleep. It is
Yeah.
rags. This thing is down to just it's it is so completely falling apart, but yet it still provides comfort. I think those things are really sweet. I'm assuming that's kind of what this bunny is like for your wife.
That it's absolutely like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you handle the dress? This is sort of like the sequins. When you're dealing with fabric like this, you must have put it on a mannequin because
Yeah.
she couldn't have sat there the whole time, and you didn't photograph it, I'm assuming, or at least you didn't use the photo as your main reference.
So the yeah, velvet is very much something that changes all the time. It's a little bit more predictable in the way that you can move it. So, I there were certain positions where I really loved the highlights that were running down the fabric, and then, as you say, like it would just change and it wouldn't be quite how it was. But you can roughly kind of get it back into positions.
Yeah.
Um, so the thing that I found really particularly enjoyable about velvet, which is different from other fabrics, is the fact that the highlights sit on the opposite plane to what you expect it should be. So
Oh yeah. Oh, I didn't
I,
know that.
you maybe see a bit better actually in another painting. There's a painting uh, of a girl in a gold top.
Whoops.
Um, there,
Oh
that's the
yeah,
one.
it's underneath.
Yeah, it's underneath, and it's that's velvet as well. And there's something I really loved about that. Um, and there's
You can't look at
in
it too
in
much as a painter. It gets confusing. It's like, whoa. I mean, it works
yeah,
because
and
we've
it,
all
it
seen
feels
Velvet.
confusing to paint as well. But that's also an example where I would push the values a little further than they are in reality. So those lights, the relationship of the lightness and darks, I push to a kind of, well, maybe it can be conceived of in reality, but I can push it to an extreme. So um, the the shapes that I go with initially, uh, the light shapes wouldn't be quite as bright as that.
Mm.
Uh,
Look at these
but
great Sargent-esque strokes you've got down here. That's amazing. I don't know why we artists geek out over stuff like that. It seems so trivial, but it's not to us. It's something about just doing less with or doing more with less. The
yeah,
the the brilliance
so
that
some
goes into that.
yeah, I mean the painters that I really admire who do it beautifully. I mean, the 19th century there are a number of like Sorolla and Celia Bow, Zorn, Sargent, like all of them have kind of a there's like I feel like there's it's not as obvious how they're doing it as it might seem. It looks like they're just sort of flashily placing the marks down. I have a feeling that they're really carefully considering the mark that they're going to make before they make it. So kind of sort of setting the ground for that brush mark that we see, and that looks amazing. But there are maybe 40 tiny, very carefully manipulated marks underneath that, for that one beautiful brush mark to kind of go into, or at least something that's been sort of scumbled very carefully. So uh, I feel like with the best bravura painting, there is more consideration underneath it than meets the eye.
Yeah, I've had discussions with a lot of artists that claim that John Singer Sargent was alla prima and that he did everything wet to wet. And I'm like, there is no way. He did not do that. In fact, I read there. What's the name of that portrait with those two kids sitting on the bed, and it's like a red cloth underneath them. Anyway,
Yeah,
you know the one I'm talking about?
yeah, I do.
Yeah,
It's a good, quite early career portrait for him, isn't it?
I think so. And I read that he did like 30 sittings with those kids because he couldn't get it right.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
not alla prima. Like he's
Oh,
reworking and
yeah, for
reworking.
sure, for sure.
But then when it's
Yeah.
done, he's got all this expressive brushwork in it, which goes to what you're saying. He's going through painstaking efforts to make it look like he did it in one shot.
Yeah. I don't know whether he would, who knows if he were alive today, would he be claiming that he's doing it all in one pass? I feel like he wouldn't be.
I
I
don't
feel
think
like
so.
the that's just quite a that's just quite a thing of our generation of painters. Um, I think there are textures underneath. Um, there are definitely layers in Sargent's work, which I think is kind of adds to the beguile of the pictures in some ways.
Mm-hmm. I even
But
think he glazed a little bit.
yeah, yeah. There's a painting in the Tate Britain of gosh, I can't remember his name. I think it might be Edward Wertheimer, and it's an unfinished picture because the sitter died before he got a chance to finish it. So it's actually quite an interesting
See, I'm
example
not
if
the
you're
only
interested.
one. I'm not the only.
You're not the only one, yeah.
There are others, other Grim Reapers out there.
And for sure, there there's I mean there's a lot of texture in it, and for something that does look like a first pass, but that's a picture that's done. That's what he was doing in one session, and that was going to dry, and then he was clearly going to work over it because he couldn't possibly leave it where it was. It's not consistent with the rest of his work. So I think you can sometimes tell that there are marks in the sort of the textures in the forehead, for example, that may look like it's the top layer of paint, but it almost certainly isn't. It's sort of a layer underneath, and then there's a sort of thin layer over the top of it, which sort of unites the highlights. Um,
Yeah, that's what I've seen
I
that with
think I
arms and
suspect he's
stuff.
quite a versatile painter. I think he probably like adapted for different
Yeah.
scenarios. He just did it all.
Well, I've
Um,
seen paintings with him with he'll paint an arm and I mean, I'm thinking of one painting I saw in I think it was in DC, and there were these vertical strokes coming down the arm. He'd often follow the form, not go across the form, right? And you see these vertical strokes going down the arm, and yet somehow the value shifts from left to right, going across the form. Does that make
yeah,
sense? And it's like there's no
yeah,
way to make a brushstroke do that, to shift to go vertically but yet shift in value left to right. And so I
yeah,
just suspect that he's very subtly glazing in order to turn the form just slightly. I mean, these are very
yeah.
subtle things. I don't know, but I've often
Well,
suspected it.
maybe he is working across and then finishes it either with a thumb mark all the way down it or with another softer brush to kind of re-establish the direction of the brush
Oh, that's
marks.
a possibility. Yeah, just to sort of rake in the
Yeah.
texture. That's a possibility too, I suppose. Yeah, that's it.
Uh,
It'll remain a mystery, I think. So, all right. I just want to look at this one more time because I feel like we didn't quite finish. It is absolutely stunning, but it brings up a question that I have, and that is: are you a portrait painter that's more of a flatterer, or are you more of a realist and more literal in your approach to painting a portrait?
I'm not aiming to flatter people. Um, I'm aiming to capture what I find beautiful about what I'm seeing. And it's not really the person so much as it's the light on them, the shift of color from one passage to another, the the variety of soft marks by comparison with hard edges. That I find there's something very naturally appealing about hairlines by comparison with the line of the skull. The line of the skull is a very rigid shape, and the hairline is sort of soft, almost to infinity. Those are the kind of things that, like aesthetically, I really enjoy looking at, and I'll be composing um, based on sort of value shapes and the sort of abstract qualities in those different values. So um, I'm not doing that in order to flatter the sitter. I'm doing that because it's the picture I want to make. Um, and I want to be able to that's the sort of approach to the painting, and then the feeling behind the painting. I want to be relevant to the person, and then that's the kind of the thought before the painting starts. Um, So there's a roundabout way of answering that.
Well, yeah, it is, but I think you do flatter. At least it seems like it to me. But maybe it's unintentional. But because you are so interested in paint and interested in edges and interested in capturing light, maybe your lack of focus on wrinkles and imperfections in the surface of the sitter, on the surface of the sitter, and more focus on beautiful edges, on beautiful lighting, by default flatters.
Yeah, maybe it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some people that feel like they look really miserable or ugly in the picture. And there's not much I can do.
Some people you just can't satisfy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, there are other artists that flatter, that clearly, obviously flatter, where I've seen their models, and then I've seen the painting, and it almost doesn't even look like the model. It's so much better looking than the model.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
clearly intentionally flattering, which I don't think that's what you're doing at all. I think you're striving for an accurate representation, but
No,
you,
so I strive for the accurate impression of them sitting there in reality. Like I know what you mean, sorry, now that you're saying with regard to um, improving their features, so getting rid of the double chin and
right.
making more of the cheekbone. I don't do that. I find I have tried that in the past and it looks wrong. It looks sort of fake.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I with the best intention, I'll try and sort of um, get the shape relationships true to what I'm seeing.
Hmm.
Um, if they happen to be sitting for me when they're not in the best sort of years of their life or like health, then I'm afraid that will be the moment I paint them.
Right. Okay, let's just look at a couple more here. This one really appeals to me because I've done similar things with abstract backgrounds. So I thought this was really interesting how you applied
Yeah,
that.
that one I was absolutely like just born of the kind of vibe of the people. So Joji Hattori is an incredibly gifted sort of virtuoso musician, and lives in Vienna. And I painted him when they just had this baby, and there's a lovely period of time where he was just playing the piano and the baby was really kind of engaging in the music, and I there's something about it that just sort of felt kind of like sort of it just felt sort of like a lovely moment, and so that's kind of the version of them I wanted to paint. The background, I don't really know why I went that direction with it. It just sort of again felt right for the dimensions of the picture and the feel of their house and their environment.
Hmm. It's an unusual composition and yet really successful. And I'm curious if you had stipulations placed on you when you got the commission that caused
No,
you to create this tight composition, or if it's totally 100%.
so one of my favorite painters is Klimt, and so this was a painting that I did in which went out to Vienna, and their house was aesthetically like it felt well a mixture of Japanese culture where Joji's from, and then that sort of Viennese. It didn't have that sort of Viennese secession feel to it, but it was kind of like somehow part of the environment in a way, and then their house was aesthetically oriented, which it just sort of made sense that this would be the aesthetic of picture that I would take.
Hmm.
And I really love tall, narrow canvases, and that's completely based on my my sort of interest in Klimt and Egon Schiele. But
Oh, you like
Klimt particularly
Chile
would have,
too?
yeah, I love it. I just think the feeling and expression, particularly in the sort of line drawings, his figures, the articulation of the bones, it feels like the most sort of bony version of an elbow you can create, and
Mm-hmm.
the pushing of sort of dynamic forms, I just think is is completely intuitive with him and an absolute genius.
Hmm.
I just adore looking at them.
Yeah, I'm a fan of both of those too. Klimt is definitely in my top 10 of dead artists. Do you ever think that you would allow yourself to be more influenced by Klimt and actually implement a lot more graphic and design features?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, the exhibition of work that I'm sort of dreaming up now has for various reasons a few sort of graphic designing elements to it, and I'm still very much kind of exploring it, but it is a
Hmm.
step away from naturalism.
I can't wait to see
Um,
that.
well, that's my goal for the next 2 years is putting together an exhibition.
Can I have you back
I've
on when we get this thing together?
yeah, dead right. I'd love it. Yeah,
That would be
100%.
amazing. Yeah, I'd love to see that. Maybe even to announce your show would be really, really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to see that. I mean, Klimt is just, man, his paintings are just so incredible. Okay, I want to pull up one more, and then I want to have this conversation with you. Let's do something that looks more official. Well, let me just browse through here for a minute. I just want everyone. I mean, I know everyone can go to your website and see these things, but okay, here we go. This is quite a commission. So, what do you
Yeah.
think about I mean, you obviously have done some pretty prestigious things and done royalty already. What do you think about the commission of the king? And I'm not asking for you to badmouth anyone or praise anyone. I'm just curious of what you think about the process and how it went, and I don't know, just your thoughts.
Well, so for sure, I mean, I definitely um, don't like to comment uh, negatively about anyone's paintings.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for that. Yeah.
Uh, but and like there are actually lots of elements because I've been to see the painting in reality, which is something that a lot of people haven't done. I think people have written about it and haven't actually been to see it, and it has a sort of scale, a sort of grandeur, which is it's very striking when you see it in person. And also, the main thing, obviously, that was made about it was the red. And there are two things on that. Firstly, photographs exaggerate red massively. It wasn't quite that kind of highlight in reality than it seemed in the photos. Also, it's I've not seen anyone sort of commented that like that is really consistent with his body of work. Like if you go through his other paintings, like there are lots of portraits where it's sort of red or blue or something. Like it's kind of like one sort of monochrome color glazed over the whole background. So it seems to be quite consistent with what he's done in the past. I thought there were lots of nice things actually about the head there seemed to be a sort of subtlety in the expression, which was well considered.
Yeah. I think what was interesting about it, and I'm not sure how I feel about it or if it even matters how I feel about it. And of course, it doesn't matter to the rest, to the world as a whole, right? But it's interesting because the Obamas had their portraits done in a more contemporary way, right? Not too long ago. And then this painting is done by a more contemporary, more modern artist. And it just seems to be the way that it's leaning lately. And maybe I'm seeing a pattern that's not really there. But I just found that interesting. And I guess that's what I was more curious about, because apparently this artist is a pretty well known artist, pretty renowned artist in Britain.
Yeah, certainly in the UK.
Yeah.
The BBC have he's sort of been was part of the sort of Maestro series, so he's sort of BBC's #1 portrait painter.
Yeah, but it's just interesting where something is that the idea, we're so accustomed to seeing traditional portraits of royalty and power, but there's this breaking away in past generations. Although Clinton had his done by Chuck Close. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was just curious what you thought of this contemporary approach to painting royalty. I think it's an interesting painting, but it's surprising because, again, not because of whether it's good or bad. It's surprising just because it's not what one might expect, right? And maybe that's the
Yeah,
point.
yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean, the
Yeah.
fact is that, I think it was the top searched thing on the sort of Times website for 4 days running, which, for a portrait, that's pretty good going. It
Yeah.
definitely went viral. Definitely went viral.
So with this one of Will and Kate, what was this experience like? Talk about meeting people that are out of your circle. Jeez Louise.
Yeah, yeah, my goodness. I mean, that was that feeling very distinctly when they first walked into the room. I actually like met them both on different occasions. So there was a sort of multi-step interview process, and she was kind of the final round was an interview with Catherine. And yeah, when she came into the room, there was that sort of sense of like, oh goodness, there she is. Um,
All of a sudden she comes out of the TV and she's a real, living, breathing
yeah.
person.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, I guess sort of like meeting anyone that you're familiar with through celebrity, that you are immediately sort of struck by the fact that they're obviously a real person, and in their case that they're really charming. Like, and Catherine particularly was very, very sort of in tune with what I was trying to sort of get at least during that interview uh, with the kind of artistic stuff. So after half an hour of sort of presenting an idea for a portrait, I kind of like got to the end of it thinking like, I think I was talking a lot of nonsense there, and I'm not sure that would have gone in at all. And but I was completely wrong. She repeated back to me all of my key points and taking it all in. And I just remember thinking like, that's pretty cool. That's impressive. She'd really sort of assimilated what I was saying. And then throughout the project, because she was kind of more sort of present within the process. I think by dint of demand, like I think William has so much on his schedule that he wasn't as free for the sort of sessions. But she really kind of like got what I was trying to do within a very short period of time when I had them together. And I had, I think it was an hour a session, and I had 2 sessions with the both of them together, and then a couple individually. And you have such limited time. You're conscious of the world's voices when you're composing that sort of picture in your mind. Because normally I have someone in front of me in the studio, and I'm looking at the way the shadows are falling, the sort of composition, the way the light shapes and the shadow shapes are composing abstractly, and then sort of thinking broadly, where the soft edges, sharp edges, where the eyes going, that sort of thing. With this, there's a whole world of chatter inside my head during that short period of time where I had to do it. Like, what if one is looking away and the other is looking at the other? What if one's looking sad and the other's looking mischievous? What if, what does that mean? What happens if his hand is too far down her back? What happens if they're sort of leaning away from each other? Like, all of that was sort of potentially subject to interpretation, and I'd never experienced that sort of awareness of how subtle tiny moments of composition can become a symbol if you're dealing with people who are so thoroughly scrutinized. Which is, was just another layer of pressure, basically. So
Jeez,
it
I can't
was
even imagine.
the one thing I did try and do to kind of like help myself focus and just sort of, because I was conscious I wanted to talk with them because I didn't want to waste the opportunity and not have a chat with them. But equally, I had all of this stuff in my head, and I really needed to get as much down as I possibly could. And I was doing my thing of doing the color study and taking photos and making film and everything. And I thought I'll play some music. It's perfect. So I had my standard studio playlist. And after about 5 minutes, they both looked a bit awkward, and William suggested, like, could we just change the track? I actually can't remember what song was playing, but I just remember thinking, like, that's a terrible idea. Of course they don't like my music taste, so I turned it off, and it was momentarily awkward, but got
Yeah, I feel like I would have been second guessing everything I did, said, anything, which is so silly because they're just human beings, but
yeah.
you
But
know.
yeah, they're really kind of easygoing. Actually, is what I found. Very charming people.
Yeah. Well, it's a
I guess
beautiful
they're very
portrait.
I guess they're very practiced with socializing
Yeah.
with people.
Well, it's been a great conversation with you, Jamie. Seriously,
I've enjoyed it.
it's been fun. But I got one final question for you, and that is, if you could give one piece of advice to an aspiring artist that you wish you had, or maybe you did have, that would be particularly helpful, what would it be?
Okay, one piece of advice would maybe I'll give two because the first one doesn't sound so interesting.
Give as many as you want.
But steer clear of your phone, social media. It rots the creative part of you. You may,
Wait,
I feel
expound
like,
on that a little bit more. Do you see me
well,
not post or not look at it?
oh no, I think post and like look at it, but just don't get addicted.
Hmm.
I've found that so much of my time in the studio over the last few years, I found has involved being kind of engaged online. And I'm not a big poster at all, but I find it has an addictive quality, which firstly does nothing for the structure of your day. B, it will expose you to a full range of arts, and you might not really know what your thoughts are about paintings. And it might also encourage inspiration in areas that you don't necessarily need to be inspired in. So you might be creating pictures off the basis of trends that you're seeing. And there's some people that do that well, but I think for the most part, it's just noise, and I don't think it's good noise. I think I think the best way you can spend your breaks when you're in the studio is looking at pictures of great paintings and feeling your way through them and trying to sort of understand them. Or I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to people that really sort of interest me and have fascinating ideas. And I actually only I've got a Where Do You Go Nokia that I take to the studio. I don't take my iPhone
Really?
because yeah, I have relatively good self-discipline, but it's really kind of exposed to me that I just simply cannot resist the temptation of opening Instagram or YouTube or whatever.
That's
And
great
when I
advice.
should be working. So I only have I've got Nokia. I've got my wife has that number, my agent, and a few other people, and that's it. It just makes phone calls. It's like a radio more or less, a walkie-talkie. So that's number one piece of advice. And then yeah, so the other thing I think is kind of allowing yourself to explore the world outside your studio. For sure, that your practice within the studio is key to making paintings and like finding what excites you. But that excitement within the studio, I think, is best underpinned by your experience of the world. And so, consciously kind of getting involved with um, whatever walk of life you're, naturally finding yourself in. I think it's just bound to circle back in a good way, in a positive manner, into your studio practice.
That's good advice. Those are both great advice, and I think anyone could use your example. Let me put it this way: I think your example to take it, what is it, a flip phone?
It's yeah, like some Nokia 6210 or whatever it's called. It's
Yeah,
indestructible.
maybe I'll start doing that. I mean, and I
It
think
honestly
all of
has
us could
changed my
benefit
day.
from that. I mean,
Yeah,
it's so
it has really
ridiculous.
properly improved my day in the
Really.
studio.
Yeah,
My family.
that's good advice, man. Hey, thanks again. It's really great getting to know you. Good luck with your baby. I hope everything continues to be well. And seriously, let's get back together when you get this show put together. It'd be great to have you back on the show.
Jeff, I'd love that, definitely.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
Okay, okay.
Thanks for tuning in to the Undraped Artist Podcast. If you enjoyed it, subscribe. And if you could, leave a comment or review. That really helps the channel. Please share the show with your friends, and if you're feeling generous, consider a monthly donation at theundrapedartist.com. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.